For your ears only for the week of April 6th, I'm David Alpern.
I'm Mark Garber with this quote from the news. For the first time, the Palestinians have something to use against Israel if it does not abide by agreements. That was Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas on breaking his promise not to apply for membership in 15 international conventions and treaties after Israel delayed completing a promised prisoner release, producing another impasse in peace talks. Also last week, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie had to apologize for using the term occupied territories before a pro-Israel Republican group convened by major donor Sheldon Adelson. Now this.
We were happy that yesterday Russia made an announcement. President Putin made the announcement initially that they were going to move a battalion back.
Today we directed our military commanders to develop additional measures to enhance our collective defense and deterrence against any threat of aggression to the alliance.
Despite the promised pullback by one battalion from the Ukraine border that pleased Secretary of State John Kerry at a NATO meeting last week, tens of thousands of Russian troops remained. And NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen declared a ramping up of plans to deter Moscow from annexing more than Crimea for supposed protection of ethnic Russians elsewhere in the region.
But what defines deterrence in this case and in these times so different from the Cold War half a century ago? And how critical are various military and economic approaches? To consider those questions and other international developments of the week, for your ears only, we're joined again by Paul Pillar, a 28-year CIA veteran, now non-resident senior fellow at Georgetown University Center for Security Studies and the Brookings Institution, and blogger at nationalinterest.org. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
Beyond the U.S. and EU economic and travel sanctions that did not prevent Moscow's annexation of Crimea and minor reinforcements of NATO units in the region, what key aspects of cooperation with Russia have been cut or threatened?
There's been very little done that's really key. For the most part, it has been, in effect, to expel Russia from the grouping of advanced countries that has been known as the G8 and to return it to what it used to be until several years ago, the G7, which is the United States, Canada, Japan, and four of the large Western European countries.
What have we seen of Russian reaction that could threaten other areas of mutual interest, from terrorism to nuclear negotiations with Tehran?
Well, not much at all. And fortunately, with regard to the Iran negotiations, there has been no indication of any withdrawal of Russian cooperation in that effort. The deputy foreign minister, although he made a statement a week or so ago, threatening, if you will, to look at Iran as an area where the Russians might push back. In fact, he's been just as cooperative in the last couple of rounds of negotiations as he always has been.
You wrote that many American policy leaders and thinkers seem to have forgotten the Cold War's real lessons of deterrence, especially the limits on threats or actual use of force, most dramatically in opposing communist expansion in Vietnam. Remind us.
In Vietnam, we assembled an army of over 500,000 troops, fought for so long that we sustained over 50,000 combat deaths. But ultimately, what proved to be the difference was that for the North Vietnamese, uniting their country and getting it out from under foreign influence and rule was more important to them than anything that was important to us in Vietnam.
Well, there's also the continuing argument that failing to counter some overseas development we dislike in one place, Syria, for example, actually invites what we see as bad behavior elsewhere, Ukraine, for example.
Well, this has been a subject of some political science research, which has demonstrated that that's simply not the way governments evaluate the credibility of other governments. And I think to understand this, just imagine if the roles were reversed. And we are assessing the credibility of Russia or China or some other power. Would we say that if that other power had pulled back or refrained from a military commitment in some area where its interests were peripheral, that means they would be any less likely to stick up for their interests where they're really vital? Of course not. And that's not the way people would regard us either.
You also say the threat of coercive action is only a deterrent if both sides understand the specific action that one wants to deter, and also the notion that the promise of no coercive action or relief from coercive action if another nation does do what we want, what you call compellence.
Yes, and the term compellence comes from Thomas Schelling, the distinguished economist who won a Nobel Prize for this kind of work. This is the sort of distinction that we often overlook with regard to those Iran negotiations, where the tendency is to think we have to continually remind the Iranians that we have the ability to punish them more and more. Well, of course, we've been doing that for years, so we don't really need to remind them of that. What is more in short supply is something to persuade the Iranians that if they do what we want, that the sanctions will come off.
While much fictional fodder for his home front was evident in Russian President Putin's speech justifying annexation of Crimea, you found some passages worth taking seriously, most notably what he saw as provocative behavior by Washington and the EU in tying Ukraine closer to the West.
Yes, well, Putin made, unsurprisingly, a lot of rhetorical hay out of comparisons with, say, how the Kosovo situation was handled, which was another situation of a breakaway province where the West not only smiled on this, but used military force to aid it, to break it away from Serbia. Putin also had some lines in there that are rather painful for us to read, but refer to the way we've ignored international law and basically told the United Nations Security Council to take a hike when it wasn't convenient for us to defer to their wishes. He was clearly referring to something like the initiation of the Iraq War.
There was also some inconsistency in the way we cheered the overthrow of a corrupt but democratically elected Ukrainian leader by demonstrations in Kiev and beyond, but not the vote by Crimea's parliament to return its territory to Russia.
Yeah, say what you want about Viktor Yanukovych, who clearly was a corrupt man. The fact is, when he was elected this most recent time, all the international observers concurred that this was a fair democratic election.
Switching subjects, what impact on the long-term prospects for a Mideast peace do you see in Israel's delay on a promised prisoner release, prompting the Palestinians to apply for full status in various international treaties and organizations?
The main fundamental problem here is that basic decisions, especially on the Israeli side, have not been made with regard to what's required in trading land for peace. And although I think Secretary Kerry deserves thanks and congratulations for his enormous efforts, I don't see this process going anywhere anytime soon.
And what is your reaction, Paul, to reports that Washington could sweeten a peace deal or even just continue talks by releasing an American Jew long jailed as an Israeli spy? He's ailing and due for release in a year or so anyway.
Well, it always was a mistake in my judgment to bring Jonathan Pollard into this, partly for what he did, which was one of the biggest cases of espionage ever against the United States. Pollard was motivated by money. He was not anyone's patriot. He was trying to sell secrets to people, not just to the Israelis. And in this particular case, it was even more of a mistake to consider doing that, because you'd have to ask, what are you buying? Not peace, not real progress in negotiations, but merely keeping the Israelis at the table for a few weeks longer. It would have been a big mistake.
Paul Pillar is a 28-year CIA veteran, now non-resident senior fellow at Georgetown University's Center for Security Studies and the Brookings Institution, and a blogger at nationalinterest.org.
Quote from the news, "We've had a lot of red herrings." That was British oceanographer Simon Boxall after China reported a ping and debris, possibly from the missing Malaysian jetliner, in an area of the Indian Ocean not earlier identified as search-worthy.
Next, lessons from LBJ, 50 years since the historic Civil Rights Act, for your ears only.